Hello, welcome back to My Time with Lynn. This is a very special episode with Jessica Tremblay. Welcome, Jessica.
Hi.
And hi. And we wanted to do a quick prologue. We recorded the full session a couple days ago, but we wanted to come back and kind of add some additional points. So I'm going to hand it over to Jessica for some prologue thoughts.
So, the discussion that the two of us had, and it is truly a dialogue. So, again, thank you, Spencer, for doing this because the process of a dialogue allows different people to share their thoughts on their own time with the LaRouche movement. And that's the purpose of these interviews and dialogue, as I now understand it. Our dialogue is a longer discussion, and both of us touched on a lot of topics. Um, And this is hopefully just the beginning of a dialogue with many people on their thoughts about the LaRouche movement and their time. It is really hard to put yourself out there in public on this and talk about being a member of the LaRouche movement for so many years. There are so many slanders about the LaRouche movement. There are so many opinions about the LaRouche movement. And there are things that are written and said on the internet, print media, wherever, about Lynn being an anti-Semite, the fact that he's a convicted felon, and other things. It is very hard for me personally to think of myself as being associated with these slanders and with these statements. My wish is that if there's anybody out there interested in the history of who Lyndon LaRouche was, to take into account that he was a complex human being and that he and the people associated with him come from many different political backgrounds, some of which I can support and some of which I cannot support. I think it is important to say that the two of us, Spencer, have, from what I've picked up, very different political convictions, and that's okay.
Hmm.
And I want to be clear for myself within days of Kamala Harris being nominated as the Democratic nominee for president, I was out campaigning for her. I took my kids along, I took my friends along. We had a really good time. I really enjoyed it, talking with people, engaging with people, discussing her platform and why I supported it. I'm saying this because our country truly is a divided country, and I do not see a quick or an easy pathway forward in the United States right now. As the great comedian Trevor Noah has often emphasized, after the fall of apartheid in South Africa, the country of South Africa went through a long period of dialogue and discussion about its past. It really had a reconciliation of apartheid. Germany did something similar. Germany had a long period which was called the Umerziehung, or the re-education of the German population, where people who lived in Germany had to face the fact that either they themselves or their parents had voted for the Nazis and had watched the Holocaust happen. I think the United States of America has a lot to talk about, a lot to discuss, and a lot of our past that we have to discuss and put on the table, and we're not doing it right now. My hope is to be at least a small part of the process of discussion. I know this is a very niche audience at the moment, but I do think discussing that what we all went through in the LaRouche movement is a very important part of history and is an important part of the dialogue right now. In that spirit, I hope anyone who has the time and the ability to watch this and listen to the discussion maybe have something constructive and something worthwhile and constructive to say and to add to that discussion. Let's get the process going.
Hello, welcome back to My Time with Lynn. I'm Spencer Cross. Joining me today is a very special guest and my first in-person discussion, in-person interview, Jessica Tremblay. Welcome, Jessica. Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for coming out, and I think we'll have a lot of fun stuff to discuss today. Fun in quotes, maybe.
Yes, exactly.
But maybe we can begin with, because you have a unique story about how you came into the organization. If you wouldn't mind telling our viewers some of that.
Sure. I mean, I'm 52, and my parents were both members of the organization. I was born in Boston, where my mom and my father, Robert Premack, were members at the time. And so I definitely grew up in the organization. I grew up surrounded by the LaRouche organization.
Okay. Yeah, so you grew up with it. You saw all the ideas. You saw all the kind of weird stuff we would do. Went to weird meetings. But you also probably saw some cool stuff and grew up around culture and music. I know classical music was something that appealed to you throughout your life. Maybe talk about what was the process where you decided to join the organization? Because that'd be a little bit different, right? Because you have some people that grow up and they just become a banker or something.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, I mean, I will say, so I lived in New York City, in Washington Heights.
Nice.
Until 7th grade. And, you know, I do have some of my childhood memories are kind of maybe different, but a lot of people have, you know, political parents. I remember my social studies teacher in 4th grade, Miss Rosenthal, was running against members of the LaRouche organization for the school board.
Yeah, that's hilarious.
And I remember being in her class, and she used, I give her the credit now. She did try to differentiate between the LaRouche organization out there campaigning and saying pretty interesting things about the school, quality of the school, and education at the time.
Yeah.
And then my obviously being in the class, and she's trying to grade me fairly. She's definitely very much a leftist, but it was definitely wild. So, you know, that's kind of, I remember walking outside the school and walking home PS 187 and people being on a bullhorn, and I'm like, I don't know either side. I don't know other side. I don't know other side. So yeah, then we moved shortly to Leesburg. We left the organization left New York City in the mid 80s, 85, and then
Leesburg was like the capital, the
yes,
headquarters.
The
of our
headquarters of the
company back then.
organization. Yeah.
Still
so stop me if
is.
there's
No, just so our audience doesn't know. Yeah.
Exactly. So the headquarters was in Manhattan, and then it moved down to Leesburg, Virginia. And my mom, and at that time, my mom had met my stepfather, Mark Birdman. One of the greatest things that ever happened to me. Probably the funniest person, the most brilliant person I've ever met.
Nice.
What a wonderful thing. But at the time, I was 11 and 12. At that time, he was not the funniest, and he was not the most brilliant.
Sure.
He was my weird stepfather.
Sure.
So,
Yep.
So he worked in Germany at the time, in the Wiesbaden office of Germany. And my mom decided to move over there. And
Wow.
yep, I didn't speak a word of German, and she put me in the German public school. We toured the American military base school at the time, and on that one she was dead right. She did not think that I would fit in too well with the American military school in Wiesbaden. So I went to a German public school.
Wow.
And didn't speak a word of German, and was definitely a little bit of an oddball with Jewish background in Germany in 85.
Sure.
There are some funny things there. Yeah, so I went to school in Germany, and I think what happened is the period that came up was my older years in high school, 11th, 12th, 13th grade in Germany, was the fall of the Berlin Wall, 1989, huge upheavals. You had a total change of how a country would be structured. You had questions about democracy, communism, economics, all kinds of things, huge political, intellectual, philosophical debates about the future of nation states, how they're formed, how to reform them, the question of unification of Germany, obviously. And so you couldn't avoid being part of this huge political discussion and process. And then the wars in Yugoslavia broke out.
All right.
And that for me was a very defining moment. I thought I would never experience war. How naive and stupid of me, but whatever. So the wars started, and if you look at a map, Germany is very, very close geographically to former Yugoslavia, the Balkans, all these areas. You had then refugees coming up into Germany, and I felt very strongly that I had to do something about it, and I, at the time, truly believed, and I think there's some validity to it, that some of the things that the LaRouche movement was offering were valid concerns on the questions of economics, on the questions of development, on the questions of nation state. They were valid points that should be made and could be made.
Sure.
So that was one thing that was very, very important to me. And I will say the other point was that Lynn was in prison at that time.
All right.
And my father was also one of the people who was persecuted or prosecuted, I should say.
Sure. Some mix of both, maybe.
Yeah, a mix of both. A little bit of a wordplay there in a sense, but definitely prosecuted in the New York State trial. And went through a lot, even though he lived in the United States, and I saw him maybe during the summer breaks and things like that when I was here, but it definitely affected me greatly that he was on trial and facing trial. He was also, as an important, for me personally, an important issue is my father suffered from hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, so he was very ill. So it was clear prison was a situation that would not work for him.
Right.
And it actually did end up, it shortened his life. There's no question. He was let out of prison later for medical reasons, because basically the state of New York didn't want to pay his medical bills anymore because he was in the hospital so much. So that was definitely part of it. And I knew that he was very sick and that he would have problems in prison. So at the time, Lynn, of course, was in prison, and I felt very strongly, and I still think that there were very questionable issues that were behind the prosecutions of members of the LaRouche movement. I felt that Lynn should not be in prison. And so I personally, it was a very much a moral decision. It was a moral impulse to want to do something about what was wrong with the world. That, and I probably was not the world's greatest student, and wasn't sure if I was going to make it too far in academia.
Okay. Fair enough.
Yeah.
So this, for our viewers that don't know, and you can clarify, but the period of the 80s, the LaRouche organization was sort of gone after for prosecutions, charged with all kinds of things. They shut down one of our magazines, Fusion Magazine, which was one of the second most popular science magazine in the country. The argument is politically motivated from the George H.W. Bush administration and elements of the intelligence community. That was the argument back then, at least. And it was a massive series of raids. I mean, Leesburg is kind of funny because our headquarters, as you mentioned, goes from New York City to this sleepy farm town in Northern Virginia. And now there's like huge FBI raids to our companies back then and such, right? So it's kind of a big deal. And then this, so you're saying like one of the motivations was this move to free Mr. LaRouche from prison and these other people. And there was, some of them got, I think Mike Billington got like 100 years.
I think it was 88.
88 years, yeah, like massive.
And that was in state prosecutions, and he had already gone to jail for federal crimes, and so it was a double prosecution, which, again, I have not looked into these things in a long time, but that was a double, I think it's called double jeopardy, if I'm not mistaken.
Double jeopardy, yeah.
Yeah, so he was definitely prosecuted twice, and things like that. It was under the Reagan administration, 85.
Yeah, right. Thank you, yeah, appreciate that. People say it was maybe more like coming from George H.W. Bush and his sort of CIA crowd, and Oliver North, and all those fun characters from the past. But interesting. Okay, so you're still in Germany at this point, and then do you stay in Germany for a while?
So I came back shortly to the United States for a few months. Actually met my future husband, Jessica Tremblay, and then went back to Germany.
Okay.
I mean, I want to be in the U.S. on the one hand, but on the other hand, 92, 93, what's not to want to be in the middle of Europe and those political situations and all the changes that were happening.
Yeah.
Opening of the East and all those kinds of things. So
Sure.
I was back in.
I'm reminded of that scene in Goodbye Lenin, where Daniel Bruhl is like caught up in this, just everything. Like everyone was in. It was such a hard for maybe younger viewers to like understand. I wasn't there obviously, but like have some appreciation of what a transformative period it was in Germany. So pretty awesome. You got to be kind of in the center of it, and also advocating for, policies that seemed to make sense at the time. At least. Mm-hmm.
Well, that's the thing is, so much of the political situation then, there are consequences today. I mean, issues around Russia, the collapse of the Soviet Union. There are some really valid things that can be discussed about what basically became, pure free market economics that were brought into Eastern Germany, into Russia, the creation of oligarchies and things like that, financial oligarchies. A lot of mistakes were made. A lot of in the sense the eastern part of Germany became completely incorporated into the western part of Germany without any questions being asked about market economy or social economy and things like that. And frankly, we're seeing the results nowadays of a lot of resentment from people in the eastern part of Germany towards the economic demise of many industrial companies, productive companies, independent companies.
Okay, so you're in Germany getting all these kind of amazing and unique experiences. How many Americans get to see some of that, especially young Americans? So it's forming your early mindset about how the world works and such. And then
I have one quick little aside. So I didn't realize this until much later. Actually, somebody I knew through the organization much later on, this is then when I was back in the US, she came up to me and said, do you realize that when you meet anybody new, basically the first thing you do is you introduce yourself and make sure that they know that you're not German? I was a little bit taken aback. So when I speak German, maybe I've gotten a little bit of an American accent back, but basically you can't tell that I'm not German.
Okay.
So I sound like a German. And it was always kind of funny when doing our organizing book tables or something, and I'd be talking with people and then they'd come up to me and say things like, I agree with you on all this, but the real problem in our country is those foreigners. And I'd be like, Anyway, things like that happen in Germany, just in the United States, just as much. So I'm not going after Germans in particular in any way.
Sure.
But it was just always kind of a little bit of an irony. So it's according to this young woman that I knew, and I thought about it later and realized it was totally true. I would basically, somebody would say hello, and I'd say, hi, my name is Jessica, I'm not German. And that was just a little bit of an aside. So I was very much a German in all ways, and spoke like a German, looked like a German, dressed like a German, and was really very much part of the culture. But at the same time, I definitely am not German.
Yeah.
So I got the inside from both sides. So
Nice. Interesting. So you get to see so many different angles, so many different things.
Yeah.
When did you end up coming back to the U.S. Like more permanently, or what kind of drove that decision?
So my first daughter, Maria, was born in 2007. And this is where a part of my experience in the organization gets much more difficult and hard to talk about. So we were back in Germany. I think I'd have to really think about it. We were probably there. We came back probably in 2003 or so, 2004. I don't remember exactly. We came back to Germany from the U.S. But in 2007, my daughter was born, and at that point, for many reasons, I decided I wanted to come back to the United States permanently. My husband's Canadian, and he was fine with that. Though he does make sure his children speak French.
Yes.
They're bilingual, very French Canadian. But and that's where it gets more complex, my relationship to the organization. There were many factors that got me to want to leave the country, but one of the main ones was I no longer felt comfortable in the organization in Germany. Yeah, I mean, one of the key factors was a disagreement that I had with Helga on her approach to the question of the responsibility of the German people for the Second World War and what happened with the Jewish population. And by regulations, I'm not Jewish. It's my father who's Jewish, but culturally I'm very much Jewish.
Sure.
And my stepfather was also Jewish.
Right.
Very left-wing Jewish, but culturally very Jewish.
Sure.
So I know, and you can discuss all of the mitigating factors as to why Hitler came to power in Germany. You can discuss the First World War. You can discuss the Versailles Treaty and the hyperinflation.
Yeah.
You can discuss all these details, and it's extremely interesting, extremely informative, and all of that kind of things. But you cannot avoid the reality that of the population that voted, a majority voted for Hitler, and people ignored what was going on around them, and that their neighbor was being taken away to a concentration camp. And it was not only the Jewish population, as we well know. There was many other people, and it was,
Sure.
mentally ill people at the beginning. It was, communists, all these kinds of things. But in
Gypsies
the end,
and
gypsies,
Slavs and
homosexuals.
Yeah. Sure.
But in the end, there's no question that there was a Holocaust.
Sure.
And the intention was to erase Judaism from the world.
Right.
So
Once and for all.
Once and for all.
Yeah.
And fundamentally, Helga again and again excused that. And I got up and walked out of one meeting and briefing she gave, and she later told me that I didn't understand history, and I told her she was wrong.
Yeah.
So I felt uncomfortable. That was one aspect. There's many
Sure.
others about it, which I mean, I love Germany dearly, and it's probably the best thing that ever happened to me. At the same time, when you continuously eat the wrong sausage with the wrong mustard and get the German look for not knowing which mustard goes with which sausage, and you intentionally provoke those looks of doing things wrong, it gets a little bit much, because Germans have a certain way of doing things, and sometimes
Sure.
I would get a little bit, I would eat the wrong sausage with the wrong mustard. And
That is such a German analogy.
but it is reality in Germany, and yeah.
When you get the wrong sauerkraut.
When you get the wrong sauerkraut, or when you have the wrong number of division of shrimp in the pasta. So, for example, when you come to somebody's house for dinner, the shrimp have been counted in general, and they're equally divided among everybody. And
Wow.
I was at one particular dinner, and it is now a family joke, where we were allowed 13 shrimps per person in our pasta. Pasta was wonderful. It was really yummy, and
Yeah.
we laughed nonstop about it. But yes.
Is 13 not unlucky in Germany?
It is. I never thought about that. Never thought about that particular aspect
The
of
real
it.
issues we're bringing up here.
13 shrimp. 13 shrimp pro person.
Yeah.
13 shrimp per person.
Wow.
Anyway, so.
Okay. For our viewers that don't know, Helga we're referencing is Mr. LaRouche's wife, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, and they've been married, I think, since the 70s. And she was sort of more so, at least from my experience, running the European organization, and Mr. LaRouche was running the American organization, but you got obviously to see that side of it. And obviously was a German politician for a long time, including to today. So for her to say something like that to you, and kind of to make these to glance over or to excuse some of the, not that she was denying the Holocaust, but
No.
but to try and put the frame for you, or that you're there watching it, to say that Germany doesn't really have an issue. It's not really an issue anymore. Like that would be hard to take.
Yeah.
That would be hard to swallow.
And I do think I should clarify. Helga did not deny the Holocaust,
Of course.
as far as I know.
You weren't saying
I mean,
that. I was just
No,
yeah.
and I think it's important, though she definitely has had contact with people who do.
Sure.
And 100% people here in the United States in the organization have the same thing. And there was a problem. There was because it's for ideals and because it's for a higher purpose, we're allowed to be associated with people who do deny the Holocaust, and that is a no-go for me.
Sure.
And that is definitely something that happened within the organization, and starts to scratch on the surface of the whole issue of why we're here and why the two of us are talking like this about what happened within the organization, and how little tidbits of truth are mixed with justification, and you create a situation where it becomes any decisions, anything is murky. Yeah.
Okay.
I'll just leave it at that for now.
Okay. Okay, yeah, I'm sure we'll get back to it
Yeah.
one way or another. So you're in the United States now. Like you went back and you had a split from them and said, even though you love this country, Germany, and you got to experience such an amazing period of change and growth, but you felt that the German organization was not something you wanted to be a part of anymore, and so you wanted to see, what was going on in the U.S. Is that a fair way to put it? Or I'm reducing it, of course.
Yes, of course. I mean, that's fine. And there's many factors. And I, personally, I wanted to be home. At a certain point, I wanted to be home. I was kind of making jokes about the sausage and the mustard, but fundamentally, I wanted to be back in my country, and I had not been in the United States for a very, very long time. At that time, when I came back, I had lived in Germany many more years than I'd ever lived in the United States.
Right.
So I definitely wanted to be back home, and there was also a lot of upheaval in the German organization, which I think I'm understanding more of now. What Mr. LaRouche referred to as the boomers, so the older generation, the people that I joined the organization with. So when I joined the organization in, I guess it was 92 or 93, I was definitely among the absolute youngest there. It was more my parents' generation that were organizers. And so I joined it as a young member. And there were a couple of other younger members, but there were very few of us.
Right.
And so what started to happen is that the members who joined in the 70s started to become very critical of Lynn and ended up leaving the organization. And I still felt a very strong loyalty to Lynn. I was definitely used as a pawn in some discussions and some things. And I let myself be used. I 100% take responsibility for my actions.
Sure.
So I was kind of used as a pawn in certain things between certain older members of the organization and Lynn and Helga and these kinds of things. And at that time, those older members were leaving the organization. And again, I don't know if I can't say really. It's hard to say I came down on the wrong side historically. I don't know. At the time, I still felt the loyalty to Lynn, and I still felt there's a lot of validity to what he was doing and what Helga was doing and what the organization represented. So I stuck with it, and these members had left. So the people who I had worked with for years had left the organization for very valid reasons.
Sure.
So there was then myself, and then there was a lot of the much younger generation, and I felt less connection in that sense to the German organization at the time. And I had been back in the United States on and off over the years, and I also definitely felt a connection to a lot of people here in the United States and to the political work here. So that was definitely part of it.
Okay.
Coming back.
Interesting. Yeah, I know we were talking a little bit before, but a lot of people, maybe it's, they have a bad relationship with a particular office or region, and they decide to go to another place and maybe find a new kind of life within the organization, and they see a little bit more positivity, or I don't know, kind of give them a second wind or something. And then you were referencing, I think the creation of the youth movement around like 99 or 2000, 2001-ish. And so there's new younger members coming in, and like you were kind of a mentor to a lot of them. Or I know early on that was at least how a lot of us viewed you. It was like, oh, she knows what she's doing. And
sometimes. Some things.
We try.
Yeah.
Okay. And then so you're in the Philly region then, or okay.
Yeah, I was mostly in the Philly region, yeah.
Okay.
But I definitely also had a connection down to Purcellville.
Right.
So I was basically given an open choice as to where to move to. I don't know how much I really want to. Fundamentally, I am very happy we ended up in Philly.
Yeah.
I really, there were aspects of the office that I very much enjoyed, and good things there. I will maybe put it in these terms. I did not want to go to Leesburg. I did not like the atmosphere of a small Virginia southern town. I had a child at that time also. I did not want my child growing up in suburban Virginia. So that was clear. Also I knew these are people, this was like my family. This was like my extended family, which we'll probably get into later, but I guess I can throw this in now, is part of the reason why my break with the organization has been so rough and was so rough, was I made a choice in 2016 to cut off relations with so many people that I'd grown up with. I mean, literally, it was like a physical break.
Yeah.
With all of these people who I'd grown up with, who I knew, who I,
spent decades with them.
And I just said, I can't do this anymore.
Yeah.
That this has become so crazy and so wild, I can't do this. But I also, at the time when we came back, 2007, it was also, I did not want to be judged by my family background of being a person who grew up in the organization. I wanted to be my own person.
Sure.
And I knew within Leesburg, people would be treating me like they're Urzet's kid, and I'm like, not me, thank you, thanks so much.
Perfect word too.
not for me, thanks. I had one person who told me once about how he used to change my diapers, and I was like, dude.
That's a weird one.
That's a weird one.
That's the one you keep to yourself.
Thanks. Thanks, but no thanks. Anyway, so I did not want to go to Leesburg.
Sure.
And the thing about New York was my father had been a member of the organization up there. So again, everybody knows me. And of course, my father, my biological father, had left the organization under very combative conditions. Actually ended up serving his prison sentence even after having left the organization. So he had come out as against the LaRouche organization and still had to go into prison. As sick as he was, it was very rough for him, and obviously in different ways for me. So I didn't want to be in the New Jersey office. Plus, also, I knew everybody in the New Jersey office and didn't want to be there. So Philadelphia was
nice
in that sense, but it also,
sure,
there were other things. But anyway, I ended up going to Philadelphia.
Okay. And then you were there, you were organizing, you and your husband, and you have a young child at the time, and you're organizing and you're kind of helping out the youth movement, and you're the whole time you're kind of plugged into the national leadership in a sense. Like you had a deeper sense, I think, than maybe your average youth member at the time. I'd say for sure. Than like just the history of the organization and kind of some of the machinations, some of how things worked on on different levels than just maybe the official way we would see it, right? So what was that like? Or, maybe what are some of the things you saw as that developed?
So I think I'm really trying to think about how I want to formulate this.
Sure.
It's not an easy subject. And I think important at this point in 2007, upon reflection, I would say for sure, Lynn suffered from dementia in the last 10, probably in the last 13 years of his life. And in that sense, I think that ended up dominating things much more than any of us realized at the time.
Sure.
That dementia and the non-recognition of his dementia. And not that everybody didn't know.
Right.
And not that everybody in private conversations didn't talk about. But there was no public discussion about how to deal with this situation.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm trying to look at it. It's almost like a diagram that I have in my mind, because you have the whole question of the political, the philosophical issues that we could discuss. It's like themes. We could go into discussions about projects. I know you've mentioned NWAPA in some
Sure.
of these discussions before. We could have a discussion about whether or not NWAPA is the right choice or not.
Sure.
I don't know. I don't really know too much about it. We can have a discussion about whether creating big projects per se is something that's going to genuinely help societies, help countries, things. So we can talk about, is that a policy that makes sense?
Mm-hmm.
And what are the effects of that policy? We can have a discussion about healthcare, which is the area that I work in now. We can have a discussion about the American healthcare system. We can have a discussion about Lynn always saying we had to solve everything else and then come back to healthcare, which I think is totally wrong. But anyway,
Sure.
So we can have a discussion about those policy issues, right? And it can be like a diagram over here. Oh, and of course, philosophy and
Sure.
political, and we could go on.
Yeah.
There's no need right now. And then we can have a whole discussion about the issues around Lynn's personality, how Lynn handled interpersonal things,
Sure.
how his dementia affected everything around us.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost like two different discussions,
Right.
but it is one. So
Sure.
how do we approach it? And that's where, if you ask me how I saw those things at the time, I can tell you about being inside the organization and thinking about political decisions and political choices and the emotions of the sense that I have a mission and therefore I can do things, and having a mission makes you feel warm and cozy and
Sure.
and feels like a nice warm blanket, and it's great, and it makes you feel super nice, and
Makes you endure a lot of things. It makes you put up with a lot of things that are questionable
yep.
or worse.
Yep. Also gives you the justification to be extremely mean, and in the worst sense judgmental about your coworkers.
Sure.
And all of a sudden gives you the right to come to conclusions about other people's lives, which
Right.
you have no right
And to
to
think that you have the moral authority, that it's actually the most moral thing you could do, and to have that sort of moral grandstand in the back of your mind, not even the back,
Yeah.
the front of your mind, like, we have to do this. We have to treat this person like garbage.
Yeah.
And I mentioned before, but the people that reach out to me it's really 1,000 different versions of that story.
Yeah.
Small or large, some quite large.
Yeah.
And that sort of justification of, oh, well, we're permitting this unethical behavior, something we know is wrong.
Yeah.
Because, well, it's the mission. We serve a higher purpose.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, so we're talking about the question of being in the middle of that,
Mm-hmm.
and then the question of later reflecting on it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it's kind of a back and forth between the two. And there was the interpersonal relations that happened, but there was then the overriding question of how Lynn was approaching things.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, and this ended up being one of the reasons I decided I had to leave this organization, was Lynn blaming one particular person for being the reason he went to prison.
Right.
And when I joined in the early 90s, again, I'm saying this judgment-free later on, but I'm
Sure.
thinking of how I thought at that time.
Yeah.
Lynn was being politically attacked. Lynn and his organization had justifiable political things that they were presenting, and questions on economics and philosophy and music and things, on the questions of classical culture. Some of these things which I think nowadays were a little bit extreme, to put it mildly, and a little bit obsessive of only classical culture is good. It's just like, okay, people, you are scared of current culture, so you're scared of modern culture. That's your problem, not mine. But so you have those issues, and that's why the LaRouche organization was gone after, because Lynn represented something, and then there was the counterculture and the, whatever, these different parts of the government or whatever are attacking Lynn. Mm-hmm. So that was what it was in the 90s when he was in prison. And then all of a sudden later, it's because this one particular person, didn't let him go on the stand. I don't even remember the specific details. Yeah. It's kind of stuff that I don't want to go back into. Sure. I can't go down that rabbit hole again.
Particulars.
Yeah, which don't really matter. But fundamentally, it was blaming this whole thing on this one particular person.
Right.
And I remember going up to people in the organization and saying, but we know this isn't true. We know who's putting this gossip into Lynn's ears, and Lynn is then turning around and spruing this gossip, and people are sitting here and accepting it, and nobody's saying this is wrong. You had other people who had been in prison with Lynn who are just sitting there and allowing him to say it and not speaking up. And I mean, my father was part of the people who went to prison. My father certainly thinks that he made mistakes. We can have a debate about that. I don't really want to particularly have a debate about it.
Sure.
It's, not what I did, but it happened. My father did not feel that he should go to prison for 3 years necessarily in a medium security or maximum security prison for what he did, mm-hmm. but he did think that he made mistakes. But that's my father. I'm not. Sure. I don't want to take issue on other things.
Right.
But that was a particular issue of what happened. Mm-hmm. So there was a change in the way Lynn was dealing with things, and it became extremely personal and extremely, this person is why I did. And it was all internal within the organization that, these people were ratting each other out, and they were, against Lynn. And it was wrong.
Yeah.
And we were not discussing that. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. I think that's really important to think about, that mm-hmm. Lynn had dementia.
Right.
And Lynn became more and more and more mean.
Yeah.
My gosh. So mean.
Mm-hmm. And
we would sit around and say that this is okay. And then what happened is people became mean and more mean towards each other.
100%.
And that sucks.
It was awful. We're supposed to be this humanist organization, and we see the leader treating people this way and attacking, thinking, justifying in our own minds, well, this is good. This is moral. This is what I have to do as well. And it wasn't everybody, but it was enough people to really dissuade. And I think it was kind of the more party line, the more cultish, mm-hmm. to use a word, the more cultish of those that were just more acolytic behaviors of following what the leader did, to attack the better people, the people who weren't really going along with it. And a lot of those people left. I think we saw that. I'm sure we saw that prior in the organization as well. But so you had an effect like some of the worst people staying. And that's, again, not criticizing individuals, like dumbing them out or anything, but just talking about a cultural process where members are excusing, condoning, and then even replicating the behaviors they're seeing.
I would use the word, for some of them,
mm-hmm.
I would say the weaker people.
Sure.
Emotionally weaker.
Mm-hmm.
People who could not face emotions that are complicated.
Mm-hmm.
People who could not face emotions, what I like to call gray zones.
Sure.
I remember a particular conversation with two people where I was talking about history is not black and white. There's gray zones. There are things that are confusing. Things are, there's no right and wrong answer. And in the end, for sure, Lynn hated that. You had to have right or wrong, and I'm right about this. And it's like, okay, that's not reality.
Sure.
Reality is this huge differentiation of gray zones or color. Probably should use colors. It's a rainbow.
Sure.
And a lot of people, I don't know, it's hard to say. And maybe it's some of the former members, maybe some of these, I don't know. I can't really say, but there's a certain emotional weakness with clinging to this sense of I have a mission, therefore I can stay with it, and I will stay with it no matter what, versus saying, wait a second, something is not right anymore.
Right.
Or maybe something never was right, but that I can't go there right now.
Sure.
Whether something was never right, that's a whole nother debate.
Right.
Maybe
Sure.
somebody will have the answer for that. Yeah.
Well, I think the commonality of a lot of the people that I've spoke with as part of this process is, something inspired them to join, something inspired them to stay, whatever it was. It could be 1,000 things. And then at a certain point, they realized something was wrong. And some people left immediately. Most people didn't. Most people had some mental gymnastics or they're trying to justify it. I mentioned I tried to reform the company in a lot of ways. I had a limited scope and my ideas weren't really listened to that much. That was part of it for me. But everyone ultimately came to some kind of similar conclusion about, okay, this isn't for me. This isn't what I signed up for. Maybe it's changed. But you do have those. I think it's a commonality, right? People have that same kind of experience. Like something's different. Maybe it's always been that way and I just am now noticing it. Or maybe something was good and now it's not. Or maybe just the compromises outweigh the good that I thought I was doing. And I think that's just a deeply common experience.
And I think what you just said is completely valid as is. I just think what you said can just be, that's valid. And kind of almost like move on, because the way you described it is totally correct. I certainly know there are good reasons, there were good things and good reasons that I joined, and I think that they were correct. And I look at the world around us. The world around us is pretty wild. Isn't an easy place to be. The world is not an easy place. It's complicated and harsh, and you look for solutions, especially as a young person. And Lynn had some interesting ideas. Maybe I will take up like something like the question of how did Hitler come to power? I know for some of my German colleagues, it was interesting and important and a stage for them emotionally to work through being able to look at the reasons why Hitler could have come into power. So like looking at the historical analysis of the Versailles Treaty, the hyperinflation, look at the poverty that happened in the crash, and being able to understand and be able to say to yourself because this is not so easy in Germany, to be able to say to yourself, there were reasons that brought us to this situation, right? But then there is, at a certain point, there's a leap, and you can't avoid that uncomfortable leap of, even though all this happened, we still accepted Hitler and we still accepted the Holocaust. So that emotional, and it's uncomfortable.
Sure.
And what I felt was happening in the organization is those uncomfortable parts were just being ironed away.
Sure.
Again and again.
You ever read Boethius or Solzhenitsyn? So Gulag Archipelagos is quite good because he's dealing with this. He's in a Soviet labor camp, brutal conditions. To be fair, I've only read 1.5 volumes of the 3, but he takes the position of, what did I do to put myself in this position? Because I allowed it. And he was just some guy. He had some position, but he wasn't Stalin or some of the terrible stuff. But he takes it from the opposite perspective of like, how did I allow this to occur? So it's interesting. And then Boethius was this top, I think late of the Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Emperor period, and he was like a top advisor, but he was all accounts like a solid dude and did not deserve it at all, but was put in this terrible prison and made out to be the traitor to the country, even though he did nothing wrong. So he's dealing with that for himself. How did I do this? Why am I here? So just kind of interesting. Homework for the viewers.
Homework, I guess, for me too. It's 3 volumes. I don't know.
It's like this much.
That might be a bit much.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, I have my notes here on certain things.
Sure.
The question of loyalty comes up in this issue. And I do know that for both Lynn and Helga, the question of personal loyalty over truth was fundamental.
Mm-hmm.
And personal loyalty over truth, unfortunately, gets into the question of cultish aspects of the organization.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I really want to get into it because it's very, very hard to think about.
Mm-hmm.
And in our discussion before, we brought up the question of personal shame.
Mm-hmm.
And I know for me, there is a huge issue of personal shame. Why didn't I notice things earlier? Why didn't I do something about things earlier? Why didn't I leave earlier? There's also, why didn't I fight for principles more, maybe, within the organization? Why didn't I stand up? I'll just take some example on the question of healthcare, because I know Lynn was just so blah about it here in the United States.
Yeah.
And fundamentally, the thing is, he knew nothing about it.
Sure. Hilburton, that's all we ever talked about.
Yeah.
Having hospital beds per county.
It's just baloney, and that's not policy of healthcare. And I happen to work in that field, as I said, and I know a little bit about it. It's just Lynn knew nothing about it. He would just make these expressions and sayings, and then there'd be articles in the EIR, which were, some of it was informative. Fine,
sure.
That's great, but it was not a policy. It was not a great policy. But so why didn't I fight for more things earlier? So part of the process of coming out with the organization and moving on is dealing with the shame. But I don't even know if dealing is the correct word, because it's going to be there. I think it's going to be there my whole life.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing that's helped a lot is realizing that a lot of people make mistakes in their lives.
Sure.
I don't think it was all bad intentions that I had with the LaRouche organization. In fact, I know there was not all bad intentions.
Sure.
And there were some interesting things. I mean, I learned a lot about economics from the LaRouche organization, and concepts of how to think about economics, all this kind of stuff. But there is definitely a certain amount of shame about what went on in the organization. But you know what? I do think I can say I've done something with my life.
Sure.
A little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I regret a lot of it, but certainly haven't had a boring life.
Yeah. May you live an interesting life.
Yeah.
Like Chinese proverb, I think.
Oh, I don't know.
Yeah. It's one of those things where other ex-members that reach out and I talk to, and they're reflecting on their process, and it's such a complex thing, because they join for the right reasons. I think everyone I've talked to, like, they're not like, I joined because I wanted money. Like, like,
don't think about that.
I think we both met members that, like, they maybe need a place to stay for a month or two. They're just, sure, let's talk about economics, and they're just going through the motion because they're in a tough spot. But everyone that I knew and was friends with, and we spent decades knowing these people, and a huge chunk of our lives doing these things with these people. They were well intentioned, and then I've talked before in previous episodes, but like the process for them to leave is so stupid, and I don't know if I'm going to say evil, but just it's definitely ignorant and cruel. I say there's a cruelty to it, at least, where you leave, you're dead to us. You're dead to us, and you can't reach back for help. Like, what ex-member thinks to reach back to ask for help in any way? You know, not going to happen. I would put money on it that they're not going to. Maybe onesie twosies. They're probably alienated from their family, their friends. They probably have no prospect for work, so they're probably dealing with just survival for a while. A lot of them that I've talked to, they still feel that guilt of, even if they were fired, for lack of a better term, because some people were, like, you're let go, they still feel like, I need to keep doing it somehow. I need to find my own way to keep doing the goals of the organization. They still feel it, even in those situations. So, like, how do they process it? You know, that's a crazy aspect as well. They still feel like that guilt and that shame. I know it's two different related concepts.
So why don't you explain that a little bit more? I'd like you. I mean, I have thoughts about it, but
so they feel like they still feel morally obligated, even though the organization,
to the organization or to the world,
to the goals of the organization,
to the goals of the organization,
as far as they see it, even though the organization spurned them. That's how deep it runs. Even though, like, these people might not even ever talk to you again. Like, I've had situations, I told you before, of people like, you're not moral enough to work with us. Even though, like, I was just curious, like, hey, let me come to a concert or whatever, or some meeting, and, like, no, you're not. Like, I spent almost 60% of my adult life in this company. Yeah. And I'm not moral enough for you? Like, and so even with that mindset that people have, they still feel guilty. They feel
guilty about leaving the organization.
Maybe they weren't good enough. That's one sort of tranche of people. Like, I wasn't. If I just tried harder, I'd still be there doing it.
So I do think. So again, this is my personal experience, or what I've gone through. Being in the organization was, for me, my church. So our society used to have all these institutions, but especially a church, a synagogue, or whatever. That was your place. You would come together. You would have a joint, maybe a political party. Maybe that would be another good example.
Sure.
Other organization, you would have these institutions that you could find yourself in and work with. And I think that, unfortunately, in our individualistic society, those have been destroyed. So religion has been stomped out by many people, sometimes for very good reasons, but
sure.
It's been stomped out, and we've kind of destroyed something. So I do think a lot of us were looking for an ersatz church in some form. And I do think in that sense, Lynn provided it. And then you're taken out of it, and so you had this warm and cozy feeling. The emotion inside of me all the time that I had a mission and I'm doing something, sometimes got me out of bed and when I was organizing in the morning, right? I'm sure you had. Sure. It got you out of bed.
For years.
Right? Because you and it gives you this strength that you're doing something good. And we've talked about the negative side. It allows you to be mean and awful to the people around you, but it really did build your self-esteem. And then when you leave, I don't know, one of the wise older members back in Germany that I've spoken to a lot about this stuff a lot, he told me, when I went back to Berlin, we would go on long walks together, which have been very useful. He told me he's never found that same emotion and same one institution.
Sure.
Again.
The purpose.
Yeah. Exactly. The purpose.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm still struggling with this very much. Where to find something in society, and it's hard.
Sure. You take a piece from there, a piece from this.
Yeah, and maybe that's the way it is. I don't know. Maybe that's the way it's supposed to be. Yeah, and maybe that's our lives. That's the how life actually works. I don't know. Yeah, I think that's really important. Somebody once said to me, guilt is a faulty emotion. And yeah, guilt, it's an interesting emotion. And is it a correct emotion? That's, I think, a really important, because how does guilt work, and what is it that's surrounding it? So if I take away the cushiness and the easiness of you know, that issue, for me, I'm trying to work away from the guilt. I'm trying to think about the shame, because the shame, for me, I can deal with that shame. At least I know, I knew what I was doing when I was in the organization. I know there were things that were wrong. I mean, I cut off contact with friends personally and other things outside the organization while I was in, you know, and I was not always kind to people outside the organization and people inside the organization. That shame, that I can deal with because that's mine. Guilt is, I think, a very tricky emotion, and I haven't figured it out, but guilt is often something that we're imposing because of what we think things should be, versus just taking that raw shame.
So one image that comes up is when discussing these relationships of people leaving the organization and, you know, talking to different people, and an image that's come up to my mind is the like abusive father or abusive parent, and you're kind of looking at like this problematic elements of toxic relationship we had, but then you want to admit that and like come to terms with it and put it in context, but also realize, okay, well, what did your parents teach you that were good? And that's kind of the nuance. It's come up a lot in the show and a lot in these discussions, is like, how do you pull what from what, and how do you find where's the grief, where's the trauma, because there is trauma involved for sure, as we've been alluding to, right? Definitely. And it's like, you know, is it from an individual? Is it from the culture? Is it from the experience, right? So maybe you have some thoughts on that.
I really like that image, that analogy, an abusive parent. I will put in a small aside, which is something painful for me to talk about just because of who Lynn was. Lynn has publicly admitted that he had an abusive father. And I'm just putting that out there because I do think that that's something which is worth thinking about in who Lynn was as a person. One of the heights of his dementia moments brought it up in one of his Purcellville discussions. Just like to put that out there.
Sure.
And I do think what you're talking about on trauma, I mean, within the organization, who you are, what you're doing, all these questions, there are traumatic experiences for everyone. This is, again, kind of an aside. One of my favorite shows to listen to is the New York Times podcast, Modern Love, because it just talks about these questions of feelings in so many different ways. And I just find it so insightful and interesting to talk about emotions and not just romantic relationships, but all kinds of relationships.
Sure.
And they've discussed different issues of trauma, and one of the recent episodes is about an abusive parent and how somebody dealt with that. And I just obviously thought about a lot of the questions within the organization and family relations there. And a parent is somebody who you're always going to have a connection to. You're always going to, this is a person who obviously in the real sense brought you into the world, and you can't say that about the LaRouche organization in that way or anybody within the LaRouche movement per se, but you know, there are good and bad aspects. But the question of the shame about what went on there it's an ongoing issue, and it's an ongoing thing to deal with and to look at, and to never give up on being able to touch that emotion. I find, I don't know how else to say it. It sounds touchy-feely, and I don't want to sound weird about it, but it's okay to feel that shame, and but it doesn't. You have your own choices. You have things around you. You cannot control all of the things around you that are going on, and you can't control all of the sometimes really weird things that were going on in the organization. You can't control other people's choices. Sorry, even if Lynn seems to think that we could control everybody's life in the organization, it doesn't work that way.
Sure.
That life doesn't work that way. So that's where the abusive parent issue becomes difficult for me, because I made a choice to be in that relationship in a certain way. But I'm trying to move on.
Sure. It's tricky because part of it's forgiving yourself, right, in so many ways. And I think that's where a lot of this growing community can help in a way to, like, because I'll just give a compliment, because to a lot of people in the youth movement, the kind of the younger generation, right, because you've been around, we looked up to you as someone with a lot of dignity and a lot of compassion.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And
Thank you.
And as someone that didn't go along with the party line, and you always had this quality of, like, why are you doing that? Like, are you just doing that because you think you should be doing that? You had a humor about it, and you had a tough, in a good way, kind of love for people to challenge them, right? And that wasn't everybody. That was only... there was plenty of great people, and that's the tricky thing. There's great people, and there's some a-holes over here, some hardliners, black and white thinkers. But you had that. You always had a dignity, and you had a mentorship role for the younger group of us, for sure. And people looked up to you, and you helped people when you were in. And whether we forgive ourselves for going along with X or Y, right? At the end of the day, we're human beings. We're trying to help, and I think you look back on that, and I think I'll probably get a lot of comments on this of people saying, like, "Hey, thank Jessica for me," right?
Wow.
I think so.
That means a lot. Yeah, it's hard. It's really hard, and it's. I hope I didn't hurt too many people. That I truly hope personally, and I'm sure there are people who I did hurt. If I did, I'm sorry.
Sure.
No, I mean it. If I did, I'm sorry. Again, another reason why I felt I had to move on from the organization, because I felt some of the choices that were being made were not choices that I actually would support, even if I know I made mistakes, but I tried to be true to what I thought was right. I definitely, that was a motivation, and it's something that you have to be truthful to yourself about, and I hope in general that I always try to think about anybody in the organization as much as possible as a separate human being.
Sure.
As somebody who in some form could make their own choices and could think on their own. And that was one of the great things. There's so many people my closest friends are former members, and God bless them, and they have so enriched my life and enriched my children's life, have made so many things so interesting and different, and so many different perspectives. I don't know, maybe I could have gotten that outside of the organization, possibly.
Sure.
I don't know, but I certainly was able to get it through the organization, was able to reach and talk to so many people and get to know so many different backgrounds and so many different people, so international people and international perspectives.
Right.
But I will say, which is kind of veering off topic in a little way, but you brought up the question of humor. And my God, it's been such a process of going from extreme sadness from leaving the organization and being very, very sad and wondering, am I the only person who thinks the support of Donald Trump is a little bit off? And I would like to qualify that at a certain point on the question of Trump, because I think it's very important from my standpoint. My main disagreement with Trump is his personality and how Donald Trump reminds me of Lyndon LaRouche.
Sure.
And when I started to see his speeches, his thoughts of, I can save the world, I know what I'm doing, turning on people in 5 minutes if they weren't loyal, the question of loyalty, weren't loyal to him, his turning on people, his throwing people out, all that kind of stuff. I'm like, dude, you are so like Lyndon LaRouche, and I want to wash my hands of this. So my anti-Trumpism is really specific to this idea that one person can save the world. And
Sure.
as we now know, Donald Trump thinks he was saved by God to become president. So anyway, that's the question of Trump. So
Quick disclaimer: all views presented are yours. And
They
with
are
respect to
100%
President
mine.
Trump, yeah, he's
they're 100%.
my
mine.
chain of command. So that's I'm not commenting. I'm just
No.
having a discussion. Yes,
And that's-
please continue.
Yes, exactly. And I respect that. I totally respect that. So I was just getting to the point of humor.
Oh,
It has
right.
gotten to the point where I'm able to laugh about these things. And, there's some points in life where you don't know whether you should laugh or cry.
Mm-hmm.
Those emotions can sometimes be so close to each other.
Right.
But we had a little bit of an email exchange, and you brought up the question of the organization and the split that happened or something, whatever. And you said something about you wrote something about the split, and I read it, and I just burst out in laughter for myself and just wrote back something along the lines of, what organization? I didn't know there was anything left of them. And I just could laugh about it.
Sure.
And it's so much better than crying.
Sure.
I mean, crying has its time and it's
Yeah.
right, but it's just so much better to just
100%.
just laugh.
There's a subreddit, Reddit.
Mm-hmm.
It's called LaRouche Posting. It's only got a few entries in there, but there's a old photo
Mm-hmm.
from maybe like 2005 of two members at a card table, and they're both like facing different directions. And on one side it says one of the names of one of the organizations, the other side says the other name. It's such a funny joke. Like they're the same place. Like, nope, we're on different sides. But yes, and you discussed it in reference to kind of the end stage of processing grief as like just, hey, like once you can laugh about it, then you realize, okay, this is maybe not totally out of the woods, but I'm on the path.
Yeah.
On the path to getting there.
Yeah. And just, being able to take it a little bit more in stride and not taking it all, it's so heavy. And that was, part of the thing within the LaRouche organization, where this contradiction of World War III is happening, the world is coming to an end, we're going to save it with classical culture. So in the end, if you thought everything was bad and everything was evil and, all of the culture around us, it's all evil, then why have a future? It was such a perspective of so...
It's messianic, and
Yeah.
we alone know what's right.
Oh my
We
God.
alone have the plan. We can't, we were very against, for the most, working with other people or letting other people in for that discussion. It's like, you can participate with us as long as it's on our terms. But we're never going to go out. And I brought this up on like a more technical point, but like we missed the boat on like podcasting back in the day because we were just so fearful. We're like, no, we can't go on that show. Like they can come on our show, but like our shows are boring because we're just saying the same things, But that was like an indication of that level of fear and like level of, we know what's right, no one else knows. The culture is corrupt.
Yeah. And definitely fear internally ended up controlling things and controlled members' thoughts and their process and the way that they function, and arbitrary fears or fears about the culture and life and the world around them. And it doesn't make sense. It doesn't, if you're so fearful of, I think the question of classical music is something which is important, because I love classical music.
Same.
I've done some singing in my life. I think I've
done some very good singing, by the way.
I think I've scratched the surface of a couple of great composers. Personally, I think Schumann and Brahms the most on their leader. I've felt at least I've seen the mountaintop with those on their leader a couple times.
Nice.
And it's so incredible feeling. It's soaring because
Yeah.
you have this sense of the beauty of humanity, all these things. But there's so many aspects of modern culture which you just throw it away. It's bad, it's this, it's that.
Sure.
and it's you're cutting off everything around you. You're cutting off the people around you. You're cutting off the current culture. You're cutting off what's going on around you, and you're cutting off the question of what beauty is and how beauty works. And I think we had a little bit of an exchange on that. That beauty is also ugly.
Sure.
And
it's not just happy and nice.
And not just uplifting. It's not just uplifting.
Sure.
And
it can be tragic and
yes.
heartbreaking and
yes.
brutal in different ways. I know, I think we'll mention a little bit, but like, to me, the view of like casting everything out, of just not allowing anything else to be a potential value, right, that you're describing about culture, to me is so deeply cynical. And to me, if you take Leibniz's point in the Theodicy, cynicism is the closest thing to evil that I can come up with, like as a practical philosophy. Like, no, it's all bad. But then occasionally someone of like a authoritative position in the organization would mention some like modern movie or something, and then now it was okay to look at that. Like now is acceptable because it's on the safe, the do not burn list.
Yeah.
Right. And then it was a silly evidence of that same sort of compliance policy.
Well, and that's kind of, again, the interesting thing was that the intention of all the people in the organization to be that simplistic?
Right.
I don't think so. Did people have the intellectual ability and integrity to always go to the full level of what beauty is? Sometimes. It's very hard. It's extremely... it's an extremely hard process to be on that level of beauty and all these things. And we were dealing with everyday life, and sometimes, I do know the example of how Kepler was able to write his books despite poverty and all these kinds of things. God bless Kepler, but not everybody's always able to be at that level.
Sure.
So I do think that there were some attempts within the organization, but unfortunately, and that is, you also have to face the reality of what happened within the organization. I think you brought this up on these 7
ethical signs of collapse.
7
signs of ethical collapse.
Yeah, 7 signs of ethical collapse. I looked at that interview, really insightful. So you have the ideals up here, but you do have to look at what happened then in the reality. And the reality was things got watered down and stupefied.
Sure.
And then if you wavered from that, you were a traitor, you were this, you were that, you were stupid, you were, all kinds of things. And so that's, again, it's a contradiction. It's reality. It's a contradiction of reality and what happened.
For our viewers that didn't see it, feel free to check out episode 7 on the 7 signs of ethical collapse. And I put my email out there, which I usually do, and solicited feedback from ex-members or current members on, read these 7 signs of ethical collapse. Look at the video, read the book, read an online article. They're pretty easy concepts. And then rate from a scale of 0 to 100. 0 was we were perfectly ethical. 100 is perfectly unethical. How much do you think the organization fit these descriptions? And the feedback I've got so far has been very, very strongly in probably 4 or 5 of those cases that we were ethically collapsed. And that's the view, right? And it's an organizational issue, and it's important to note that like any organization can have this problem, right? And one of the big ones in there is good in one area, atoning for bad in others. And that was like, to me, that seems probably the cardinal aspect of it, which is just saying, well, because our mission and our principles are so high or so lofty, that we can excuse all this other stuff. And we never really even want to talk about it. We didn't have the mechanisms or the desire to self-reflect and say, hey, maybe we're doing things wrong. I mentioned before, and I haven't talked a lot of specifics, but I was a reformer, especially as I, went up the ranks or whatever and had a certain level of respect or credibility, whatever that was at the time, of saying, hey guys, I think we're doing this wrong. Like, I think we should think more about this. And it mostly fell on deaf ears. Some people say like, yeah, I agree with you. That would be good if it would change, but like there's no desire to change. And to me, that's almost like a meta example of like, we just didn't care. To me, from my experience, we just didn't care about changing it or fixing it. I said, no, we got to focus on the external and organizing and fundraising and getting X or Y policy across. And to me, that was one of the most demoralizing aspects of it, you know, because they just didn't have the ability. They didn't have the drive or the will to say, no, we should. That if our ideas are so great, then we owe it to all the members in this company and all posterity to make those changes and make it better. But there was just never, my experience.
Interesting. I will disagree with you fundamentally on one point.
Okay.
I don't think it's not because people didn't care.
Okay.
I think one of the main factors was a fundamental character flaw of Lynn.
Okay.
Fundamental character flaw of Lynn. With all the political stuff, interesting ideas, we can discuss the politics. I think I've said this before.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, Lynn's core issue and problem was he was an egomaniac and did not allow criticism. Certainly was not within the organization. I do know, for example, one of the reasons why the Eastern European and Russian work was so interesting because there's these incredible scientists who had a dialogue with Lynn on economics and other such things. You would just have these situations where these Russian academics would just be like, or in music, like Norbert Breinin on certain things. I think the quote was, Breinin said, I don't know about what Mr. LaRouche says about economics, but about music, he really does know something. So so Breinin would have discussions with him and arguments about certain things and say, you're wrong, Lynn, on certain things. On other things, you know, questions that Breinin did discuss with Lynn, which are fascinating issues, Motivführung within music, are, you know, Lynn brought this part of the dialogue. But again, I will say, within that discussion, these questions of Motivführung were not the inventions of Lyndon LaRouche.
Sure.
You say sure, you were not allowed to say that in the organization. And that's the important, that's what I mean. That's why I'm like reacting like that.
Yeah.
The problem was the flaw of Lynn himself personally being an egomaniac. And therefore, any discussion around anything you're saying care about change, it couldn't happen. Unfortunately, fortunately, I don't know how to formulate this sentence. Truly, I don't. There's Lynn and his ideas, which were, of course, from many, many different people. Lynn is one of many economists who have interesting things to say, one of many, you know, philosophers who has interesting things to say on some things, right? But fundamentally, what happened is Lynn was an egomaniac. And I do think another thing for Lynn, which was, I think, made his life more and more difficult, was not only that he was gone after politically in these trials and gone after for what happened there, and he had a certain popularity about him in the 70s and 80s, I think. But what happened is he became very unpopular, and I think that his ego was very much affected by the fact that he didn't win political votes. There was no vote fraud. I mean, come on, there was no serious vote fraud.
Sure.
I mean, maybe there was some here and there, but there was no fun. Lynn never really won huge elections, and a couple of times, like in Illinois, in that primary where they did win, it was acknowledged, and that was real.
Sure.
But otherwise, no, Lynn did not win, and there wasn't vote fraud. It was that Lynn didn't appeal to a major part of the population.
Demographic,
yeah, and that's, I don't know if that's good or bad. I'm not giving on that one. I'm not giving a value judgment. Just because he doesn't appeal doesn't mean he was wrong.
Sure.
But he didn't, and that affected his ego.
I think the smear campaign had an effect as well.
Oh,
you know.
Of course.
Yeah.
No question. And it had an effect on him personally, though he wouldn't admit it.
Sure.
So I think that the fact that he was not successful added to his egomania. So then, therefore, again, you're kind of, you have the ideas, and then you have the personality of Lynn, and this I will say very clearly, independent of Helga as a person, in Germany, the culture in the organization was not like that when I was there, and I do think this is why a lot of the boomers ended up. The older members, I don't want to call them boomers. I think that's disrespectful. The members who joined in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
the reason they left was they were sick of the culture of Lynn is right all the time. A lot of these people were independent thinkers.
Sure.
Whether I agree with them or not, I don't know.
Sure.
You know, but they were independent thinkers in their own right.
Yeah.
And I will say, in the United States, the culture of, and that was induced and people self-induced, kind of self-brainwashing of, did you see what Lynn said? Did you see what Lynn said? It was like, I don't, okay, Lynn said it in a certain way. It's like, there's part of it like, what the fuck?
Yeah.
You know, who cares?
Right.
And that anything was justified was by what Lynn said. And I think that is one of the key fundamental flaws, and I have that as on my list here, fundamental flaws, is this egomania at Lynn.
Yeah, I think I take your point, the minor correction, and I'll try to incorporate it because I think it's a good point that, in terms of the ethical collapse and the will. And I think if you have that at the top, right, that quality of mind, then any willful attempts to improve are going to be non-starters for everybody. So like there's, I think in the mindset of like someone who wants to be a reformer to bring up some of these ethical issues or just problematic organizational structural issues, they think, well, if the guy at the top isn't for it, it's a non-starter. Why even try? And that cynicism, that corrupting force, right? If you have that, then it makes perfect sense. And you're going to just slowly demoralize, or you're going to go high and right. We say in the military, you're going to go hardcore, like party line. We have to do it this way. And it's kind of funny, like there's an issue in the military with like chain of command, or like if you there's this book, Turn the Ship Around, Captain David Marquet. If you're coming up as an officer and the structure is you just take orders from the person above you, then once you get to the top, you have no clue what to do because you've been a follower your whole career. So you have to flip it. And it's just interesting. I think I brought this up in a previous episode. I think one of the other structural flaws we had is there was never a plan for what happened when Lynn's gone. And that was super apparent. I mean, a couple years after, it's a major split, right? You're cutting your entire force in half, and like they're only so effective. And it's not like a dunk on them. It's just like you feel bad. And one level, you're like, man, these guys. More to the point, though, that there was never a plan, or if there was, no one knew what it was. Oh, we're just going to keep. Lynn dies. We're just going to keep on the mission. That's not a plan. That's not a plan. But it's more to your point about like, if you're just putting all your faith in this person has flaws, and you can't even go against that, what are you expecting is going to happen when he's gone? You're just going to have all these other people that went along with it the whole time, you know?
I mean, in a certain way, you're kind of reading my mind on the question of what happens after Lynn's death. And,
sure.
And I will repeat again, because I think this is really important and for me, this was key in deciding to leave the organization, was Lynn had dementia at least 10 years before he passed away. Probably, I think 13 is my theoretical guess. Whatever, doesn't matter. So he had dementia, and his choices, in a certain sense, maybe I'm going to get in the most trouble, and the most difficult thing I have to say about this is the question of the support of Trump. In my heart of hearts, I know that the Lynn who was smart and there and thoughtful would not have been a Trump supporter, because Trump is so into these simplistic, stupid little things. And for all Lynn's other issues, he was not often simplistic in things. He tried to be a little bit more... Quite the opposite. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Quite the opposite. So, I mean, I knew Lynn wasn't going to support Trump. So I was like, okay, I can leave this organization. So there was a certain part of me which was, to that sense of, we have to move on. And yeah, it is extremely important. Lynn was not able, I don't know if he didn't feel secure enough to be able to say, I'm handing this on. I don't know what it was, whatever. In a certain way, I don't really care anymore.
Sure.
But it's just like, I don't know. He did not have the strength and the ability to say, what is the structure that's going to move on? And it can't just be these continuous quotes of, did you know what Lynn said this? Did you know that Lynn? It's so friggin' boring. It's just boring, and it just repetitive and goes nowhere and has no meaning. It's just there's nothing to it. And because there was no plan, it's become so meaningless. It's so funny. I actually now remember the interchange that we had by email after I watched one of the videos here. You know, I wrote to you, and then we had a bit of a back and forth, and then you wrote, I think it's really important to say that the organization, or whatever's left of it, I don't know exactly how you put it, they're not the only ones who has the right to write their story, or they're not the only ones who can tell their story, and it's not just their story.
Sure.
And I just literally wrote back, what organization? Yeah. I mean, maybe I'm repeating myself a little bit, but it was literally, what organization? There's just nothing left that has any meaning, really. So that's the good, in that sense of, it's resolved itself. It really has resolved itself. And to be able to laugh and just say, what organization?
Sure.
And it is a result of Lynn's major personal flaw. And that's again, I'm getting very emotional about it, how I used to cling to that.
Sure.
I used to cling emotionally, like, it's like, you know, you're just hanging on, like, this will get me through the day. This is what will make me happy. This is what will give me the sense of there's meaning in my life. This will give me the emotional fulfillment of doing something, of having a meaningful life, all these thoughts. And not only is that empty, in many, many ways, not to say there weren't good things that went on, but in many ways it was an empty feeling, a meaningless feeling, but it's resolved itself. That emotion has resolved itself, and the organization has resolved itself.
Yeah. Reminds me of a joke, and it's a little bit adult, but remember The Jerk, Steve Martin? And do you remember The Special Purpose?
No, sorry.
So he grew up, right? He grew up with a family of African Americans, and they said that his male organ was the special purpose. And then when he met this young gal, you were talking about, like, after you leave and you don't have that purpose anymore, but then this young gal comes and she says she's looking for something, is burned at Peters. She says, I'm looking for someone different. I'm looking for someone with a special purpose. And he gets so excited. I have a special purpose. That's only mildly related.
That's your sense of humor.
I just want to throw it in there.
Okay, that's fine. That's acceptable. That's the special purpose.
Because we gotta laugh. We gotta laugh about this stuff.
Oh my God, we gotta laugh.
That's my point. That's the overall point.
It's one thing.
I have one.
Yeah, my stepfather, Mark, he got such a kick out of the Yiddish word. The German word for jewelry is Schmuck.
Okay.
It's also the Yiddish word for that male part.
Sure.
And he just got such a kick out of things like, you would be walking around in Germany and there was a Israeli couple who had opened up a jewelry shop and it said Israelische Schmuck, Israeli schmuck.
Yeah.
And he couldn't stop laughing.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great.
That's a little bit of Yiddish humor in Germany.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice save.
Yeah.
It's a great point about going through the grief, contextualizing the experience for people. I brought it before. There's a lot of people that leave the organization and they never want to think about it again, or they don't know who to talk to about it. Current members, maybe they alienated the other members they work with, right? So they don't have a process to deal with it. So this will be useful for them, I think, and I think we will get good feedback on that. Reaching the point of humor is a great. Parts of it. So many parts of it are such a comedy.
Yeah.
You know, like when I was in the Navy, people would ask, you joined kind of older. What did you do before this?
Well,
it's like, I was with this group, and how do I describe it?
Yeah.
And part of this show is almost honestly, one dimension of it is a shorthand to say, look, if you're curious, watch this show, because
Yeah.
I'm never going to do it justice.
Yeah.
A 5-minute discussion. I worked in politics. What does that
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
Really? Like,
Yeah.
I'll tell you 2 stories and you'll think, what? What group were you with?
Yeah.
What did you do?
Yeah.
You did that? So that's great for context. And I think it's important to just, we talked a little bit on, in a break we took about like, forgiving yourself for certain things and realizing the context of your own actions and realize, we're trying to do good. And maybe through that process, we will compromise ourselves for some period of time or for some period of actions. And then, I know we both reached out to people we felt that we'd wronged in one way or the other and like, hey, look, I'm sorry. And the response has always been good in our experiences.
Yes.
And maybe that's not everyone's experiences, right? Because some people, like I said, don't want to ever think about it again.
Mm-hmm. And that's their right. And that's
absolutely.
If that's how they're going to handle it.
Absolutely.
That's their way of dealing with it.
And that's one reason I haven't really reached out to a lot of people about the show. I just sort of let it come in. It's more of a word of mouth thing. Like, look, I'm happy to host anybody.
Yeah.
But I guess if you have any final thoughts on just your process or how you think about this whole thing.
Yeah. It's a valid part of history.
Mm-hmm.
It's a valid part of transition from the 20th to the 21st century.
Mm-hmm.
The 20th century was in many ways the American century.
Mm-hmm.
And we are transitioning to a very different, very diverse century in the 21st century.
Multipolar.
Yeah. Multipolar, multicultural.
Mm-hmm.
The 20th century had many rudiments still of, I guess, Judeo-Christian culture.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Lynn was stuck in that century.
Okay.
As a thinker, as a human being.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was a valid part of that culture and that history. And we're all children of our surroundings.
Mm-hmm.
And we've come into a new century, and so many things are changing. Values have been thrown out, as we know. And not that this hasn't happened in history before, but there was certainly a huge amount of values being thrown out. And many of us were searching for ways to deal with that issue. And I think on some things we came out on the wrong side. On some things I think that was very valid.
Sure.
Now we're in the 21st century, and I don't think Lynn made that switch.
Right.
So that's that. For me, it is a process of, as you mentioned, going through those stages of figuring out the stuff about the organization and what went on. For me, it's also giving my children a perspective of what their parents did with their lives, because it's very hard for them to understand. Very hard. God bless them. Incredible young people.
It's hard for anyone to understand.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, what did you do?
I mean, I will say this. About 2 years ago, for the first time, I expressed complete regret about my life in the organization. So it was kind of like a V shape. I'm no longer there, of complete regret. And it was my daughter who just turned to me and said, "But Mom, what boring lives we would have had. Who would I be? Who would we be if you hadn't done all these incredible things?" And I'm so thankful to her for that.
What a wonderful gesture.
Thought. And also so mature, and I'm very proud of her for that. Very proud. So that's the personal aspect, and then there really is the aspect of I definitely have met some of the most incredible people in the world through the organization, and I think we're all going through a process of figuring this out and trying to be open about it in a world where when you put something on video, when you put something on tape, that's why it's scary to do this, because now I'm publicly admitting this connection to LaRouche. Not that it isn't on the videos and traces here and there, but I'm publicly, again, in my current situation, talking about it. And it's hard. It's really hard. but I don't know what else to do. I can't carry around this secret anymore. And everybody's going to process it differently. But it's there. I would say, for me, the most important thing is no longer basing my life on what I did in those years, and that's everything, and trying to disprove Lynn wrong and hearing this. I need to detach from that.
Sure.
I have my own life, and it's there, and I'm fine with it, and I don't need to prove or not prove that Lynn was right on this philosophical point or not. It's just not. He's not that interesting. He's one of many people, and it's fine. But I have to also step away.
Yeah.
And life is life, and life is beautiful and wonderful and hard sometimes, but it's there. So that's kind of my thought of how to deal with it. And thank you for doing this, Spencer. I mean, this is pretty amazing. It's pretty amazing.
Thank you.
To take the time and the energy to do this. And I think many of us have thought about it, but have had no way of figuring it out. And I mean, I've thought about writing things and commenting on things, but there's also the dialogue process is so important, and it's so important for our 21st century.
Sure.
So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. One final anecdote story to kind of, you reminded me of it. I don't think I mentioned this before, but the Counties were two phenomenal human beings, and ones to which I had a closeness growing up on the West Coast in the organization, dealing with Maureen on financial stuff, and knowing Mark from the historical side of things. I was honored. He asked me to review his book on Robbie Burns, which is a great book. And when he passed, I was stuck on the East Coast. I wasn't going to be able to make the funeral on the West Coast. But for our viewers, it's weird. So we had the LaRouchePack.com website and the LaRouche Pub. And there was this stupid inside joke about, we should make a LaRouche Pub, like a pub, right? And you might remember when we were, we had a political period where we were talking a lot about Jerry Adams and Sinn Féin and certain Irish politics, which I loved.
I have a little bit of Irish to me.
Nice.
You can notice.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I created the LaRouche Pub. Do you remember this?
No.
There are these short little comedy videos where we made it look like we're in a bar, and it was convincing enough that people in our Leesburg office said, "Hey, where's that bar?" And it was just our studio. But after Mark passed, I sent out a notice to the people on the East Coast, like, "Hey, I'm going to open up the pub, and we can do a eulogy. You can say your piece." And it was nice, because we just kind of had it open and people could come. And I think part of it for people is this process, in a way, one dimension of it is a type of eulogy for their relationship with the organization, their relationship with the person who they were in different ways, or in all aspects of that. Them being able to say their piece with that eulogy and move on with their lives. So that's one part of it, and I think one of the values of it. So anyway, just a little bit of final image for you.
Yeah.
But no, thank you so much for coming. I think we'll get a lot of good feedback on this one.
Hopefully.
And I think it's going to be a lot of value to a lot of people.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I have been thinking a lot about how to be able to laugh around things in the organization. And I have come up with an idea, and I'd like as many people as possible to participate. And thank you, Spencer. You've already offered to add into this. I'd like to start a little bit of a video challenge, and I want to call it My Weirdest Discussion with a Member of the LaRouche Movement. So because I'm starting out, theoretically, we should have one per person, but you can have as many as you want, of course. Yeah. I'm taking the liberty, certainly, to start with three little stories. Two of them are on one issue, on loyalty, and the third one is a little bit different. So the first conversation that I had that I'd like to mention, the weirdest moment of a discussion with a member in the LaRouche Movement was a discussion that I had with Helga at her farm, as whatever they called it, called it Windy Hill in Loudoun County, Virginia. Um, and I was there, and as usual, crazy stuff was going on. So Helga called me over and claimed that I had created an international security incident. Whatever, I'm not going to comment on whether that was real or not. But in that discussion, Helga said, quote, personal loyalty to Lynn and myself is more important than truth. I just stood there and thought, okay, I'm just going to let that statement sit there again. I'm going to repeat it. Personal loyalty to Lynn and myself is more important than truth. End of discussion. The other discussion I had on loyalty was with someone who ended up going to what I think is now called the Helga faction of the split. And this person also supposedly was later suffered under Barbara Boyd or was persecuted by Barbara Boyd within the organization. Whatever, I don't know.
Sure.
Okay. So shortly before I left, this person went on a walk with me and said, we have to stand as a united front and we have to trust each other no matter what. Everyone in the LaRouche movement has to be together. No more criticism. And I turned to that person and I said, do you mean you're going to trust Barbara Boyd? And that person said to me, yes, we have to trust and support Barbara Boyd. The main reason that I'm bringing this up is that for me, it is so clear. You have to trust your own sense of judgment. You have to trust your own sense of gut feeling about other human beings. And if your gut tells you that something is wrong and something is not going well, you can't just say, I trust this person no matter what. You have to trust your gut. So anyway, those are my two little stories. I have one last one, which is my favorite, but go ahead, Spencer.
Okay, yeah, I have one too. I love the idea. I very much appreciate the initiative and the humor of the idea itself, Jessica. So thank you for that. And when I was reading yours, or you tell me about them, I was like, okay, well, I have at least one that springs to mind. I'm sure I have more in the chamber I can think of when other guests want to come on and do it. But it was my first conference. It was the first conference where we did these conference on the West Coast and the East Coast. And it was in 2003, and I was 20. And I've been reading Lynn's papers and all the documentation, talking to members, and it's like, okay, I think I get this stuff. And I could feel there's like an obvious push to get young members to join at this conference because it's like a big, I don't know, notch on the belt if they could or something. And this unnamed older male member like sat me down. And it's kind of like you could tell like he had been asked to, hey, try and seal the deal on this kid. And so what are you thinking about? And like, what are your doubts? And I asked about the Prop 64, Prop 69. And for our viewers, like, and I brought this up a little bit in the show episode with George Rogers, but in the 80s, AIDS was coming out. We saw it as a big public health crisis. We didn't, to my knowledge, we didn't care that it was related to homosexual activity. We saw it as a big public health crisis, and we wanted to put AIDS and HIV on the CDC's communicable disease list. That's like at least how I was told. And but then our critics tried to paint us as though we were against homosexuality, that we were like trying to, because in the CDC's quarantine list, you can quarantine a communicable disease, like in extreme circumstances. This is an unknown disease. Um, so the argument was, oh, the LaRouche organization wants to lock up the homosexuals, which is like, I would not work for an organization like that. So it was just a question in my mind. I didn't know that at the time. And I did mention in the George Rogers episode that if anyone's seen the movie Dallas Buyers Club, we like it's pretty good. It won an Oscar, Matthew McConaughey. Uh, our organization makes a small appearance in that film on TV, advocating for Prop 64, 69. Kind of funny. Anyway, I didn't know that when I'm asking about this. I'm repeating slanders. What's this thing about you guys want to maybe, lock up homosexuals? And this older member is like, no, 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 that's just so I wanted to set that up to show like there's a background to this and the response, the sort of lower level response given to me from a person who was like mature in the organization. And he says, "Oh no, that was just Hollywood, just united with like the right wing. It was this weird alliance, and a lot of these Hollywood types are like intelligence guys anyway." I'm like, okay. he said, like Robin Williams, like he was a big guy, and like, he speaks Russian. Like that was the proof. Like that. I'm like, okay. I know a few people that speak Russian that are not KGB agents working for the Hollywood elite. Like it was just such a weird. I'm
Did
like,
Williams really speak Russian?
I never looked it up. I kind of
That's would be even more fun.
if he didn't, but that was like the death. That was like his big move. Like, well, he speaks Russian. You think he's a KGB agent
Because he speaks Russian.
working with Hollywood? I don't know. So that's to me is like, all right, whatever.
Here
Anyway,
we are. Here we
that's
are.
that was like one of the earliest just like ridiculous things that someone told
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's kind of funny. I
Anyway,
mean,
do you
as
have a go ahead.
yeah, I just wanted to say you joined anyway. No, you don't have to put that
I,
in. You can I'm sorry.
no, no,
You
I'll keep
please cut that down.
I'm keeping that in. That's hilarious.
Is it?
It is. Yeah, it is.
I'm sorry, because that
I was
was what's
like,
going through my head.
well,
Like,
it's like a great idea with like, dumb people, you know, like all right, sure, buddy,
sure, exactly. Sure, buddy.
sure.
Okay, but my weirdest conversation with a member of the LaRouche movement, this is my official first choice, was in December of 2016. So Trump had been elected at that point, and I had already made the choice at that point that I didn't want to be around the organization. Um, as I've said, because of Lynn's dementia, and the organization came out clearly in support of Donald Trump. And I was not going to be part of that. So December 2016, I get a call from somebody saying, you should come down to Leesburg and the New Year's Eve celebration, sing in the choir and sing in some songs and sing some leader and be part of the celebration. And I told this person, I said, I'm sorry, I don't want to be in a room full of Trump supporters. And this person said to me, where did you get that slander? And I said, do you not read your own briefing? Did you not just read Helga's statement from just a couple days ago on a conference call that you are supporters of Donald Trump? And this person then turned around and said, we are above politics. You don't know what you're talking about, Jessica. We as an organization don't go with factions. We are above all political people and certainly not supporters of Donald Trump. So I just took my cell phone, like moved it away from my face and was looking at the picture of this person and the name of this person. And I was just thinking, oh my gosh, you have actually drunk the Kool-Aid. You're telling me you don't support Donald Trump and your own briefing says that you support Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Anyway, that was definitely my weirdest moment and was one of those moments where I was like, yep, just have to move on with my life.
I was thinking about it earlier today too. Just one kind of final note on that. Like, and again, this is not to be political. I'm not making a
Yeah,
political statement about our
yeah.
president or anything, but just about that time in the organization before I joined the Navy or anything like that. Um, just a couple years prior, a good friend of mine and I went and did an interview with this former congressman, Neil Gallagher, who was a long-term enemy opposed to Roy Cohn, long-term associate of Donald Trump. Like again, no comment on political today, but just at the time with that shift, that was just a couple years prior, and like it was a real quick turn. So for what it's worth in terms of, supporting adding a second sort of argument to your point there about that. It was a big shift. So, and this person you're talking about knew that congressman very well.
Here we are. Here we
Here we
are,
are.
Spencer. Here we
Here we are.
are. And the good news is we're still here.
Yes. If anyone would like to submit an entry into this new fun contest of ours, please, I'll put my email here as usual. Feel free if you want to come on just to do an entry, that could be fun as well. Or if you want to do it as part of a future interview on the show, I'm happy to entertain those offers as well. But thank you again, Jessica, for this.
Yeah. Looking forward to some fun times. Maybe there's some latent comedians among us.
I hope there are. Okay, thank you.
Okay.